Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Agenda 2025, the annual conference of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Well, today we might have set a free-op record for the collective IQ points on one of these Zoom calls. We've got a remarkable group of people who I'm fortunate to call friends who are going to talk about the question of, is big tech still a source for progress? With me today are Joe Lonsdale of 8VC, co-founder of Palantir, a number of other companies who recently relocated from Silicon Valley to Austin, along with many of us who are also Austinites here, including Evan Baehr, the CEO of the Teneo Network and a former senior staffer at Facebook and other, and super plugged in the tech world. Sal Churi, who is a general partner at Trust Ventures, a venture capital firm also here in Austin that focuses on regulated industries, and a former professor at the University of Chicago. And then Vivek Ramaswamy, who's the founder of Roivant Sciences. He launched two of the, I think one after the other was like the biggest IPO of the year in the biotech industry in 2015, 2016. And another old friend of mine, former colleague from my Wall Street days, and super talented and very interested in a lot of these topics as well. So we're going to get into a lot of interesting things. We're probably going to leave a lot on the table in terms of things we can't get to. As a reminder, we like to go straight to your questions right after the first round of answers from the panelists. So if you got a question for us, tweet at us at #Agenda2025 or hit the Q&A button on your Zoom window and ask your question there. Vivek, I'm going to start with you. Are Google and Facebook monopolies? We have this traditional doctrine in antitrust law that says if things are free for the consumer, it can't be a bad monopoly. But is that an outdated theory, or is that something we should revisit, or is that still operative here? Or Google and Facebook's doing good things, and we are just too cranky and we're not appreciating them for all the good they're doing for our lives?
Yeah, so I basically think that monopoly antitrust doctrine is the wrong way to go in attacking what I think is at the core of the problem with big tech's corporate power. Today, just to be clear, in my opinion, a lot of the antitrust allegations upon inspection are actually going to show specious. We have numerous products, widespread consumer choice available. Products are relatively cheap. These big tech firms are competing with one another in the market for products. But I think the real problem isn't the use of market power to beget more market power, which is the thing that antitrust law is supposed to protect consumers against. The real problem today is the use of market power by these big tech firms to exercise cultural power, social power, and political power. And that's not something antitrust law should do. It's not something that antitrust law is equipped to do, but I think it is the big question about capitalism in the 21st century is how we ultimately think about the use of firms' market power to exercise the other kind of power that threatens not American consumers, but threatens American citizens at large by restricting debate in not the market for products, but in the market for ideas. So I'm happy to say more about that, Ovik, but those are some high-level thoughts to open with.
Joe, I remember I saw you on CNBC recently with a forceful defense of the competitive nature of the tech industry and the traditional approach to antitrust. What's your take on this? Are these big companies, do they have too much economic power? It certainly feels that way to the layman like myself. Tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the Borkian model of antitrust from his 1978 book, The Antitrust Paradox, where he said we should focus on harm to consumers, not harm to other businesses, versus what was really the kind of the Brandeisian model before that, which is that big businesses themselves are dangerous because they're big. And listen, I think concentrated power is scary in our society everywhere it goes. What you've seen consistently is that when you have a really big business attracting top talent, that the whole world does benefit from that. And I really think you have to focus on the consumer side. Vivek's correct. There is a lot of other challenge here. I think that there is a challenge to have a company capture a large percent of our public square and change the conversation in our democracy without being fully transparent. So I definitely think in terms of how we want to run our country, there's a lot of new rules we could pass here to force more transparency, really radical transparency on people who are controlling our conversations. We know why they're throttling things, know why they're censoring things, and really understand that. I think there's also a huge thing to do with educating people in Silicon Valley and around the country on the philosophy of our country. You have people who study STEM and are the best in the world of STEM and clearly haven't thought very much depth at all about the philosophy of liberty and the philosophy of history of our nation. So hopefully we can diversify out of Silicon Valley to places that respect freedom, but also teach that philosophy better. So there's definitely a lot of things to work on here, a lot of ways to confront this. We should be probably using the government to confront some of the threats to democracy. I think antitrust is not the way to go.
Let me put it this way, to give an example of the kind of economic criticisms you hear of a Google or a Facebook. Take advertising. Online advertising is dominated by these big tech companies. I think of the local newspapers that are going out of business all over the country because advertising dollars are getting soaked up, or a big increasing share of them, by these big tech companies. Is it good for consumers if local newspapers go away and we rely on a Google search engine for information about our local communities?
Well, is it good for consumers if Starbucks replaces their local coffee shop, or if McDonald's replaces their local areas? Is it good in France that local bakeries are going away? Was it good to replace all the small steel mills with Alcoa? And that was a big worry for Brandeis, in the old days, and those sorts of things. I mean, it turns out that having someone top down decide how the economy should work is clearly far more dangerous historically than it is to allow consumers to make decisions and have the results of those decisions be what we live with.
Sally, your venture firm, as I mentioned, is focused on highly regulated industries and how to disrupt them, how to find the new Uber who can get around the taxi cartels. What are you finding out there when it comes to dealing with monopoly power and competing in industries that have entrenched power?
Yeah, so I think I come at this not from the realm of the titans like Joe and Vivek are talking about, but rather kind of the small tech world, right? And I think when you look at the way that early stage companies and smaller companies organize themselves, it's often in response to regulatory action, right? Big companies are often the only ones with the resources to be able to comply with sort of all the regulatory and legal edicts out there. And so what you often see is entire industries, and these can be titanic industries, organizing themselves around these regulations, which creates kind of a de facto monopoly, right? So if you look at something like nuclear, right? The nuclear energy industry was entirely dictated by the way that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in conjunction with the Atomic Energy Act and the Department of Energy, kind of laid down our nuclear frameworks, and it's been impossible to break out of that, right? And so you've got this one world of sort of de facto monopolies, right, where there are big companies who are the only ones with the resources to be able to kind of create compliance systems to deal with these huge kind of regulatory regimes. On the other hand, you've got, kind of what you call out, which is the Ubers of the world, where there are actual de jure government granted monopolies. And so you look at the story of Uber kind of breaking open the taxi monopoly. It was a story of taking occupational licenses and emptying them of their value. So I think we, as an investment fund, really look at monopolies a lot like piggy banks. If you can break them open, there's a lot of value hiding inside, and there's a lot of opportunity for society hiding inside. There's a lot of valuable technologies that can be brought to market. And so if you can kind of break those log jams, which is what we spend a lot of our time strategizing on how to do, you can kind of create a lot of value for society by getting rid of these old monopolies in sort of the earlier stages of the economy.
And you're right, of course, Sal, that Facebook and Google probably want more rules in order to help them keep their monopoly for a long time. So I think the question is, if we are going to put in some kind of rule to protect our democracy, let's not apply it to small companies. Let's only apply it to the super big ones, is at the very least that we can do.
That is an approach to regulation that we don't see as much in the U.S. We see it in Europe more, where large companies are held to a higher threshold of regulation than smaller companies. The one place where we are seeing it now in the U.S. in particular is banks, where post the financial crisis, we've seen a higher capital standard for large banks with more assets than ones that are smaller, that are theoretically less of a systemic threat. Evan, you spent a lot of time on all ends of this question, and it's a pleasure to have you on a panel, because usually I'm used to seeing you as the moderator of panels with all sorts of interesting people. Your thoughts on any of this, whether it's the economic piece or the cancel culture piece of it? You've had a vantage point to all of it.
Yeah, well, it's much more fun to ask the questions than to answer them, but I'll take a stab. Really just sharing two things for your viewers today that you may not have come across. Two perspectives I've really appreciated on this question. The first is a documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which is a really fascinating sort of documentary into the early days of mostly Facebook, but also Twitter. I was at Facebook for a short stint and was there when a legendary growth leader, Chamath, gave a talk at Facebook, and he essentially laid out what would it mean, or what would it look like for Facebook to become a nation state? How would Facebook achieve national sovereignty, And one of the elements would be Facebook must build an army or a militia. And at the time, it was like kind of funny. And so it's really interesting to see years later, Chamath is now one of the early Facebook people who's actually featured in this film, essentially making the following case. And Joe was actually there and knows these people, so he should really weigh in with what actually happened. But essentially, Zuck had this product idea, this hunch, this thought that if we built this thing, it would be valuable for our users. The question was, to what business model do you connect this business to generate profits, to feed the beast and continue to grow the product that we want people to have access to? It just happened that the business model to which they attached this product, which is the form of, as Zuboff in Age of Surveillance Capitalism would describe it, essentially trading in human futures. It's not an attempt to persuade you now. It's an attempt to drive a consumer addiction to people and content and a product that would then understand and help the advertisers and people monetizing the platform actually understand your future. In some ways, more than you would understand your own future. And so Zuboff kind of makes the case in this excellent book, it's very long, it's a great book, that it just is a somewhat of a coincidence that the likes of Sheryl Sandberg and others that said, to what business model do we attach this thing, really unleashed this beast of a platform. So I do care that the curators of Twitter and Facebook, it seems to me, are censoring more conservative content than liberal content. I do care about that. What I care more about is walking around a shopping mall these days and seeing, a few kids just glued to their iPads playing games and consuming content as they walk through a mall, and knowing that young people, I think, are on television time, screen time, 37 hours a week. That's the sort of social, cultural, economic time bomb to me that is being planted by these companies, which I think is far more serious than the question of whose content gets suppressed.
It is a really interesting question, right? I think Senator Hawley, who I don't agree with on a lot of things, he said it's like selling drugs, and that really is the goal of the tech companies, is like what engages you the most and keeps your attention the most, because that's how they make more money. I tend to think of it, Evan, as something that was bound to exist in some form. It's almost like when our VC world, our entrepreneur world, it's not like we're only creating the future, we're also discovering the future. We're discovering what's possible. So if Facebook hadn't done this, somebody else would have done this, because it's such a good business model, because it is a possible way to get people's attention. So it's like this thing exists that's possible to be discovered. It's like a stage of humanity we are bound to go through. And it's a very interesting question. To what extent can we alter it? And to what extent, can we change our culture and how we educate our kids to respond to it? I'm trying to limit my kids' screen time because I'm very concerned about it, but I don't think there's easy answers to this one.
Well, just a quick one on that, Joe. There's a scene from this film, which maybe we'll toss in the chat. It is such a good documentary, but it talks about one of the product managers reflecting on this kind of notification was one of the most engaging notifications, is the following. When your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend shares a photo on Facebook, that notification, given as a push notification that your ex shared a photo, is one of the notifications that most likely drives you back into the app. Something about that feels wrong.
It's human nature, right?
Wow. I mean, I guess one of the things that I would add to that conversation is I do, to go back to Joe's point from earlier, have some issue with discriminating or distinguishing between regulations that impact the large companies, the behemoths like Facebook, differentially from smaller companies, only insofar as we have learned from history that larger companies are masters at using that regulation to further build a greater moat, to further entrench themselves in their own position. So I think it's going in the direction that we've already been taught not to go. I don't want to harp on Section 230 because I think that people have made a bigger deal of its implications than are due. But it's instructive as an example that if Section 230 defamation liability protection didn't exist, and for those who aren't familiar with it, that's effectively a provision that says that platform companies like Facebook and Twitter get special protections from defamation liability that an ordinary publisher, like those local newspapers that are going out of business that Ovik mentioned in the beginning, don't benefit from. If that was never written into the statutes in 1996, we would not have the behemoths that we do today in the form of Facebook and Twitter and potentially other social media companies, but rather have a more competitive marketplace of publishers and platforms where the line wasn't so neatly drawn on day one in a way that the market could have ultimately decided whether there were publishers, platforms, hybrid models that ultimately gave consumers greater choice, but not only greater choice for consumers, more importantly, would have resulted in models that may have also selected for for feeding on human virtue more than on human frailty, and ultimately create, I think, a greater breadth of products that would have taught us more about the brighter sides of human nature than the sides of human nature that Facebook and other social media companies today prey on as a matter of addiction. And so I personally think the right answer to all of this is actually a form of deregulation all the way down, deregulation that goes to excising out the kinds of corporate privileges these companies have hardwired into statutes that ultimately allowed them to get as big and powerful.
Wouldn't that just unleash tort lawyers, though? Just go have a field day against every possible model online where people are talking. When you just constantly have everyone suing everyone else?
Well, I think that the companies would adapt their business models in a way that made the products work in such a way that would not be the steady state equilibrium, because that was clearly not going to be a sustainable state of affairs to have a pleasant use of a product if everyone was suing everyone left and right. So that's just one stop.
So for example, I have a lot of companies I'm working on where we do let people talk to each other. We do let people post things. We wouldn't be allowed to do that without 230. So I agree with you. There's some things to potentially modify there. I'd be very careful about throwing it out, because it would actually break up a lot of business models for startups as well. They're trying to let people participate on platforms where right now we're not liable for what they say.
Yeah, I guess my own view, Joe, is I agree. I'm sympathetic to that. I think that if we work that cycle out one step further, we'll get to a different equilibrium where those companies, through market competition, through innovation, are able to develop models that accommodate that set of concerns.
Yeah, the model that I find most likely, if it's of interest, is you probably end up having, and I apologize, but a blockchain model. Blockchain is such easy to mention, but actually probably relevant in this case because if the platform's liable, there'd be no platforms. You probably end up having the same engagement model. It's one we would create with an anonymized thing that's distributed and impossible to sue, basically. And I think that it ended up evolving that way, is my bias. I think you'd have something similar, just Facebook wouldn't necessarily own it in the same way. But there's a lot more to dive into there about exactly how it might work.
Well, these two guys are way smarter than I am in terms of what happens under the case of Section 230 reform. I just want to give a little human element. It was an interview I heard on NPR about a year ago, and it helped give a little bit of a human side to how difficult the question of content curation is. And many conservatives are very quick to rail on how Facebook's putting their thumb on the scale. Two quick examples. The first was, hey, guys, we have to think about it. The internet before Facebook was a pretty dark and scary place, not just the MySpace pages, but the internet in general. It was filled with pornography and gore. And so in some sense,
now it's all gone.
Facebook did a lot in this, but hey, this is an interesting example. So there was a no porn, no gore, no murder policy for Facebook content. And then the Boston Marathon bombing came along, and there was this epic photograph of a guy being carried out with his leg spewing blood. And the question was, that is gore. Do we put it out there? In that case, they decided to allow it. A later one was, they said, what is porn? They said, well, definitely not going to put nipples on there. Well, they then found a group on Facebook organizing of nursing mothers who said Facebook is discriminating against this beautiful act of nursing moms. And then, anyway, the point is, there are some good people wrestling really hard through some of these really difficult decisions. And so I don't know that they're making the right call, but they're putting a lot of smart people to try to answer it.
It's definitely hard, and it's definitely impossible you're always going to have some point of view you're pushing, right? The example I like to give is, they're like censoring all these bad things from the right. Well, what if, there's a guy out there who's murdered thousands of people, and he's especially proud of lining up gay people and shooting them and murdering him. Should you be able to celebrate him on Facebook? And that'd be, maybe no, if you're censoring bad guys. And then you think that's actually Che Guevara. That's what he did. He murdered huge numbers of gay people, and he's all over Facebook, and we celebrate him all the time. So it's just, if you're coming from a left perspective, you don't consider the far left evil. You only consider the far right evil, because there's just lots of these things I think people are getting wrong.
I think
go ahead, Sal, please. Just go ahead.
An observation on sort of the Borkian versus, maybe post-Borkian consensus is, right? And I think this goes to your point, Vivek. It used to be about, hey, let's make sure consumers are getting what they want. Now we're sort of shifting into this phase of, like, the voluntary nature of it is no longer good enough. We have this sort of paternalist instinct to say people are getting too much of what they want, right? It's like, to Evan's point, is it a good thing that we're feeding you content about something you really want to know about, which is your ex going on another date or whatever it is? But it is voluntary, right?
Yeah, well, it's the heroin argument, right? This is the Senator Hawley thing. It's a form of a drug, is the argument. It's a tough one.
I know Vivek wants to go to the Q&A, so I'll just indulge myself one last comment. But Salen, what you said was so spot on, that I often say that capitalism would be the perfect system for governing world affairs, like literally perfect, if what we wanted was identical to what we needed. And nearly everything that's wrong with capitalism can be explained by the delta between that which we want and that which we need. And I think that leads into the broader question of what Joe was even saying earlier about public squares. What I was talking about, the way in which market power bleeds into social, cultural, and political power, is actually filling the vacuum. We're missing the point here, is actually filling the vacuum in cultivating a new form of human virtue, a new form of human foundation in public squares, in the sphere of our lives that goes far beyond the market, through the revival of civic duty, through the revival of our forms of identity that go beyond that which we're tempted to click on. That's actually the black hole vacuum that we're missing. And by building that up, we ultimately close the gap between that which we want and that which we need.
Well said. We got tax culture and the knowledge apps for it. Very well said. That's right.
All right, let's get some audience questions in here because they are accumulating. Let's start with Esther Dyson. So Esther says, and maybe I'll steer this to you, Sal, but anyone pipe in. What about the impact on workers? Glenn Weil, who some of you may know, Glenn Weil likes to talk about the fact that one of the challenges with monopoly power we don't talk about enough is you have a large employer in a particular town. And if the only place you can get a job is that employer, then your ability to get work somewhere else is damaged and your economic prospects are damaged. Is that something we should be thinking about more? How does it affect your work and your ability to liberate people from those paradigms?
I think we do a lot of thinking about, is it a good thing that we only have one company that employs people? But on the other side, it's one large company can employ people everywhere around the world now, right? I think we're all having this conversation on Zoom. I think it's sort of axiomatic that we're now in this moment where, the bigger the company, the more they can kind of be that long tail employer, the more there are opportunities for people all over the world, right? You see these sorts of platforms that we've invested in a number of marketplaces, right? I'll just give one quick example out of our portfolio, a company called Variable. You can use it to staff up a factory very quickly. And they've got people across the states that are, during COVID, their factories got shut down. Now Variable growing very quickly. We hope all of our companies will be big tech companies one day, can employ people across the country, right? And so I think the modern realities of the workforce create opportunities where we're no longer in these sort of Pullman towns where, there's one boss and
I totally agree. I think the important point here from an economic point of view is a lot of people were worried about the same argument in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that these companies that dominated the Fortune 500 are going to keep getting bigger and we're going to just everyone's going to have to work for them. And you've seen the opposite. You've seen a huge amount of creative destruction, a huge amount of turnover. Even with these big tech companies, our economy is much more distributed than it was 50 years ago. And a lot of these tech companies, as Sal is noting, are actually creating lots of diverse opportunities. People can work from anywhere for them. So I definitely don't think you have this threat of like a company town or like only one place to work. Maybe in San Francisco, there's a few of them that are too powerful, but in general, I think there's just lots of opportunities to work anywhere you want.
Joe, a question from Patrick McKenna, who was on our panel yesterday. If Facebook acquired Twitter, would that be good for consumers? If not, what's the consumer benefit case for Facebook acquiring the Instagrams and the WhatsApps of the world? Would you be okay? Would you be okay with Facebook buying Twitter?
I don't think
you see that's
a benefit case for or against them. I think it's a good case for Facebook as a business. It made a lot of sense. The next platform that was going to emerge was a mobile platform. That was a big threat to them, and that was the way they stayed relevant, was to building up and helping build the next mobile platform, being part of that. It's not clear Instagram would have been what it was if Facebook hadn't bought it. They would have had to spend a lot of money building a competitor. Maybe theirs would have won that way. But I mean, it's not, our free society doesn't just do whatever it wants because it might be good in some sense for consumers. What it does is that we allow businesses to compete and build these things, and only if there's really clear economic harm are we supposed to interfere. I think that's the way it works right now, and I think that's the right way. Otherwise, there's no point in even letting someone run a business like Facebook if they can't defend themselves and they can't figure out what the new platforms are going to be. And I'm biased. I was first early investor in Oculus, and Mark paid a lot for Oculus because he thinks VR AR is going to be very important in the next 10 years. And I think he should have a right to do that. And frankly, because he's doing that, VR AR is probably going to be a lot better than it would have been faster because he's spending billions of dollars a year on it right now, trying to get our society there because he thinks it's a threat to his business. If you say he can't do that, I think it'd be actually really bad for our society. There'd be a ton of talent and money not going to advancing it.
Hey, Ovik, just a
Go ahead,
quick
Evan.
point on here. With respect to some of the cancel culture, the woke culture, how these content platforms are silencing people, I've seen some interesting things argued recently that the content censorship question on Twitter is really a question around the chattering class. You know, at the point where Jack is personally deciding that the Senate Republican Conference cannot promote a New York Post story about Hunter Biden. It's a real inside baseball game, but it sits at the top of the funnel of feeding a lot of our elites, a lot of our institutions, a lot of the media platforms that many journalists actually rely on Twitter to find their stories. The question of content censorship on Facebook feels to me a little bit more about, you know, my Aunt Ren, who's a Pentecostal that many leftists would call a deplorable, who lives in Central Florida. It's a really different question around what kind of content is being censored. In that sense, I think the dilemmas they face are a little bit different. Also, though, companies are led by people. I don't know Jack. I barely know Zuck. My gut says Jack is a Marxist. My gut says that Zuck is a classical liberal. His speech at Georgetown on the future of the internet in China gives me hope that he's smart and he remains committed to the principles that we share on this call.
You know, that segues into the next question we have from David Johnson, who asks about, or he cites George Gilder's argument that the Google's centrality as an organizer of big data is maturing and nearing its the end of its useful life. Do any of you see that? Are there disruptors out there that maybe, whether it's blockchain or any other decentralized type platform, is there something coming along, some disruptive technology that will dislodge Google the way
It's
Google
not a
dislodged
pitch.
others?
It's not a pitch I'd be eager to fund, to be honest. I think Google's still getting a very, very top talent and has a huge network effect. And I think if anything, they're becoming more and more dominant. And I think it's going to be very hard to disrupt them. So I hope he's right for the sake of everyone. It's great to disrupt the big players with new ideas, but that seems tough to me.
On the other hand, and in the scheme, just to you know, I don't disagree with what Joe just said in the moment right now, but you know, just to take the other side for a second, in the scheme of corporate history or the history of innovation or the history of capitalism in the United States, we are in a short flashpoint since the time Google was founded as a company relative to where we are in the year 2020. I mean, General Electric once held a market position as a leading company in the United States, and GE is struggling to preserve its existence today after, you know, one CEO after another is in flailing attempts to keep the company alive. And that's just over the course of less than a century. Yep. So I actually think that none of us are, you know, paid compliments aside, none of us here are smart enough to be able to know what the ins and outs of that
from a 50-year
disruption looks like.
I totally agree. From a 50-year perspective, no idea.
Yeah, and I guess that's what brings me to what I think the real problem is. I think that will happen. I don't know what it looks like, or at least I can speak for myself. I am not smart enough to tell you what it looks like, but I think history teaches us enough to know that we can be confident that it's going to happen. But it won't happen. The only thing that would stop it from happening is if Google exercises its control over the permanent monopoly of government over lawmaking, of government over the use of military force, of co-opting the social forces that actually bind our nation together. And I actually think that, you know, that's why I am so bothered by the exercise of corporate power outside of the market, and that I think that eventually the market moat just sets up a bar that the next product needs to clear of having intrinsic characteristics that overcome the extrinsic network effects that were created in a prior generation before. That's just capitalism working over the long run.
I'll tell you the one other thing Larry Page thinks is going to give.
But where the problem breaks, and just to finish the thought, the problem breaks, and I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Joe, is where the problem, where the system breaks is when those actors, unlike the robber barons of the prior era, as we're seeing today, exercise the kind of trust. When Google says, don't be evil, we're getting out of China, but secretly works with the Chinese government to set up a new search engine that ultimately maps onto the CCP standards, that is evidence of earning a type of public trust in Google. And Evan, not to pick on you, but even the kind of trust that you vest in Mark Zuckerberg is, I think, the kind of trust that we as a public ought to be really careful not to vest in the leaders of these companies, because that is then just a short, slippery slope to ultimately ceding control of our democracy and over our
government. My thinking has evolved to that point, Vivek, where I think I'm suspicious enough of their power over our democracy that I think at least requiring radical transparency in certain things is important. I'll tell you the one thing Larry Page also thinks will walk him in as his barrier. They honestly believe in Google that AI is going to reach the singularity or something like it in the next, in a couple of decades, and that they're the best in the world at that. They're putting billions of dollars into it. they believe that they can get to it first, then they kind of lock in this permanent lead where they have the very best AI that's just smarter than everyone, which is kind of creepy, but that is actually a big part of their corporate strategy, just to put it out there. So it's pretty
Wow. That is terrifying.
Ova, can I toss a question to these smart guys?
Yes, and let's give Sal first at bat, because I always feel like he's in the corner over there. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I'm curious about is when I see Microsoft make acquisitions like LinkedIn or acquisitions of all kinds of stuff, generally it means that the product is going to die, and rarely do successful companies grow through acquisition. So if you just look up, if you Google, ironically, failed Google products, there are dozens of companies that they bought and then they killed. There are dozens of things that they launched on their own, Google Plus, Google Glasses. I mean, it's actually hilarious to look through this list. And so on the one hand, it looks like Google, yes, they have a lot of cash. Yes, they can have exceptional talent. However, if they keep on spinning up these products that fail, that would suggest that, you know, the end could come unless they have unique access to data on all of us. And that becomes the moat that becomes how they're defensible. So I guess the question is, does their flailing of products and the attempted acquisition signal that the end is near, or is there some unique IP around which there's a moat?
I think, you know, the skeptic in me just says there's an oil derrick sitting in the middle of all of this, and they're building lots of things to obscure what's going on in the middle, and that search is really that oil derrick, right? And there are all these other products that are cool and exciting, like self-driving cars, and but really, and this is, I think, Peter Thiel's argument, which is they're doing all these things to convince you they're not a monopoly in search, right? I think this also gets to that point of when you hear people talk about breaking up big tech, they're always short on specifics. And so I think it's always like, concretely, what does it mean to break up Google? Does it mean you're going to put search over here and, you know, X over here? And I think if you did that, I'm not sure you would have much of an effect, right? Because I think it's really that search, you know, to the extent there is a monopoly, it's in search, right? Does the sort of baby bell model work for any of these companies? I think you have to remember that any you know, the something must be done sort of mentality leads to concretely something being done by the United States government. And you have to wonder, what precisely does that look like, and will it be better than what we have today?
I totally agree, Sal. And I think we have to be really careful and stop. I think a lot of people here are probably more liberty oriented, maybe some more conservatives. And just because we don't like a lot of people at Google, just because we disagree with them, doesn't mean they're not still good for America. I think Bell Labs was extremely good for America to have a monopoly with that kind of talent that attracted from around the world and created all sorts of innovation and advances. It's actually a great thing that we have Google, still a place that hires very top talent, still to take this money and use it towards innovation. Evan, you're right. There's a lot of things that haven't worked. There's a lot of things they're doing that are pushing the world forward and that are successful in a lot of different areas of bio and enterprise and otherwise. Even the stuff they do with self-driving cars, they may not end up owning it, but they've created a lot of things. People have worked there, gone off to build other companies that are quite impressive. I mean, I do think it's good for America to have Google be strong. I don't want the only really strong one to be Baidu and Tencent. That would not be good for us, you know.
You know, a bunch of you have brought up the point about the data, right? The data that Google, Apple, Facebook, and others are accumulating that's become a competitive advantage. I think about that as a healthcare guy, right? In healthcare, we pretty heavily regulate the transmission and ownership of patient data through HIPAA and other very large and complex statutes and regulatory frameworks. Doesn't it make sense that we might want to, at some point, have some sort of regulatory framework around the way tech companies vacuum up consumer data?
Those healthcare laws have killed hundreds of thousands of people, as you know, like literally killed hundreds of thousands of people. Like we would be right now knowing how to treat cancer better in ways that could have saved my mother-in-law earlier this year. It could have saved so many other people who died of cancer and so many other diseases if we didn't have bad regulation in healthcare. So I really hope we can fight to fix what's broken in healthcare and not break the rest of our economy with the same things. That's my view.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Is there a regulatory framework for the way that consumer data is there a way to basically do a better job than HIPAA, I guess, the way, but I totally grant your point, Joe. Is there a better way to do it, or is there not? Or do we just have to say HIPAA, we're all going to read these 500-page user agreements and check the box and surrender?
I agree with Joe on the lessons from healthcare, and I think HIPAA was envisioned in the beginning as being the better version of HIPAA, and then it ended up being HIPAA. And so I think that the hubris of believing that we know exactly how we're going to design that in a way that betters consumers and betters society. I think just the reality of history has taught us that again and again, it's if it's going to be imperfect, it's going to be imperfect in a way that actually further entrenches the monopolists who are already in control of that data in ways that prevent new people from coming up with newer models.
GDPR is a perfect example. It's destroyed job growth, destroyed business creation in Europe.
Absolutely.
Everyone thought it was really clever and great. Mark Zuckerberg and other people loved it because it's good for Facebook, whether or not he actually agrees with it.
It's great for Facebook.
Yeah. This is horrible stuff. We should definitely not be doing this. We should be fighting it with every ounce of our being to keep these areas free and keep innovation growing.
Does the California version of GDPR have the same effect, Joe? Are you seeing that?
I haven't studied this enough. I've heard a lot of criticisms of it. Unfortunately, I don't know well enough to be an expert on that yet.
Let's get back to this point about the social addiction that a number of you brought up, particularly you, Evan. This seems to me certainly one of the most powerful arguments, or at least the areas of concern about a big tech and social progress, right? That we're creating generations that are addicted to their phones and interacting with the world in ways that are not as humane as those of us who are older are used to. Actually, maybe the way to start this off is Joe, you actually, in the last week or two, if I recall correctly, announced on Facebook that you were leaving Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg actually wrote in your feed and said, was it yesterday? Yeah, so breaking news, Mark responded, and so tell us about that. Tell us that story, because that'll be interesting.
I was really frustrated because I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post defending Facebook when a bunch of people were attacking them. I thought the boycott of Facebook was fundamentally illiberal. They're fundamentally trying to force them to censor.
Remind people what that boycott was about for people.
There was a bunch of people in Hollywood who were in other places saying stop hate for profit, and they wanted effectively people to stop Facebook from rooting our democracy by having things spread on the right that might be fake or that they might disagree with or that they might think are hateful. Which of course they get to define what's hateful. They're going to define things that I might think sometimes are reasonable as hateful because they assume conservatives are doing things out of hate sometimes when they're not. And so depending on your point of view, censorship does not work depending on your point of view. If you're on the right or on the left, like imagine if Donald Trump got to censor what was political on it, like CNN would be banned, right? It'd be ridiculous. Whether or not I like CNN, you shouldn't be banning it. So anyway, all these people, and I had a lot of friends in Hollywood who was like, Joe, I didn't really agree with this, but I was being shamed and attacked, and they were trading me. They worked me on something else. If I sign up to it, it's kind of like one of these things where progressives shame everyone to try to boycott it, and everyone's afraid to stand up and say anything. So I stood up and said, this is wrong, and then Zuck's like giving in on a bunch of these things. He's saying, oh, it's more equitable. We decided to go ahead and ban certain things. And I'll give you these. I mean, he wants to talk about against the Holocaust. I'm Jewish. My 100-year-old grandma, still alive today, lost close family in the Holocaust. She was born in Poland. I don't think you should be able to, whenever someone wants to argue on it, let them argue in the open. Don't force the argument underground. Even on that issue, I believe people should be able to say what they say. You should be able to fight about it and disagree. As soon as you start censorship, it's a very dangerous thing. And so Mark gave in, and there's lots of evidence, people being shadow banned or banned again who shouldn't have been banned. And what happens is groups of progressives go around and they'll flag an account they disagree with, and it gets it banned. And then sometimes if you have enough influence, like I flagged it to Mark, he unbanned one of the guys, Brett Weinstein, but it's just, I don't know, the whole thing is just really frustrating to me. And he kind of went back a little bit on what he said. So screw it, I'm off this for now.
Evan, you follow up there. What do you think? Yeah, so that's less about the social addiction piece and more about the free speech element of all this, which we're all concerned about. Actually, let me turn it back to you, Joe, and throw it out to the panel as well. One thing I know you've talked about, and others on this panel have talked about, is the importance from a progressive point of view of free speech, right? Like we're used to talking about free speech in the sense of, well, free speech is important because it allows me to say things like, denying the Holocaust or whatever. Having that freedom is important intellectually to someone with classical liberal principles. But I know you've made the case before about the importance of free speech as a culture for creativity and innovation. Talk about that.
Totally. I think society historically has always worked top down. Only the top people who are already empowered with their own frameworks get to speak, and they get to decide what speech is acceptable or what ideas are acceptable. And this is obviously not good for everyone else. I mean, liberty was a very populist idea 300 years ago because the human experience had been that without it, only people in power ever got to say what they wanted, only got to do what they wanted. So if you want the ability to experiment and innovate in ways that may help people who are not, this is the whole Trump thing, which, listen, I'm not really, I disagree with Trump on certain things, but there's this whole Trumpian thing where he spoke for a lot of people who didn't feel heard in our political system. And because he was doing that, people wanted to ban him from talking. And, you know, again, I don't agree with everything he said, but there were certain issues on trade and immigration and otherwise that certain people have felt left out of our political system. And that's an important thing. It's important to be able to help the bottom of society who are not usually part of this, no matter who's speaking for them.
Hey, Vivek, a quick follow-up point. So some people say things like, listen, whether it's internally as a company or perhaps on a content platform, when things are clearly wrong, it is fair to not give voice to them. So let me give an example to talk about how this kind of thought narrowing actually relates to the question of how do companies innovate, and whether we're shareholders in those companies or just people that want great services, we should all care about how can companies innovate. So here's the story. About a month ago, a friend of a friend, a dark-skinned Caribbean man, software engineer, starts at Dropbox as an employee. And Dropbox has rolled out a very aggressive, initially half-day diversity inclusion training event, which then turns into weekly sessions. So in this half-day event, this dark-skinned Caribbean engineer is sitting there, and the woman who is running the session is a fair-skinned, redhead Irish woman who begins the session by saying that she identifies as Black. He then, the dark-skinned Caribbean, asks her more about that, like, tell me how you identify as Black, because this is confusing to me, because I am Black and you seem like a fair-skinned redhead. And he was referred to HR. And he was told that when you ask questions like that, it violates internal policies. And so what comes out of this is not someone who is obedient on questions of race. It's someone who doesn't raise his hand because he fears questioning anything. And so my friend who shared this story with me is now his manager. And he said the guy sits there sullen, he doesn't challenge anymore, and he follows orders. Those are the kinds of people that lead to companies stopping innovation.
Yeah, well said.
Vivek, you've spoken a lot about, and you have a forthcoming book, I should say, that's entitled Wokenomics. That, at least I think that's the preliminary title. That's about this topic of companies and the way they're handling some of these questions around intellectual diversity, shall we say?
Yeah.
What's the standout example or case study in your mind, to build on what Evan was saying, that really got you motivated to think about this topic?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I'll pick up on Evan's point, and then I'll come back to yours, Vivek. One of the points from my book, one of the chapters in my book is entitled "The Church of Diversity," and a story that I tell is actually one of my favorite stories from literature, from the story of the Grand Inquisitor, written by Dostoevsky, which I won't give you the full length version, but the short version is that in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition, Jesus himself shows up in the flesh in Seville and is accosted, is arrested by the Spanish Inquisition, brought in front of the Grand Inquisitor, who ultimately sentences Jesus to death because the church no longer needs Jesus. And I think that this is effectively what is playing out in slow motion before our eyes in the Church of Diversity, where in the name of diversity, right, in the same ways, in the name of Jesus, in the name of diversity, we are actually arresting and sentencing to execution the diversity of ideas on which our democracy ultimately thrives. And to me, the book is actually about the adoption of these values. I focus less on the content of woke culture as much as the way in which woke culture has been adopted, has been co-opted by self-interested companies for their private gain. That's codified in this modern movement that we call stakeholder capitalism. And I'm often asked, what's the opposite of stakeholder capitalism? That's normally defined as the idea that companies should pursue social good that goes beyond their for-profit motive of delivering products and services to consumers. What's the opposite of stakeholder capitalism? Isn't that just shareholder capitalism? And I actually think the opposite of stakeholder capitalism isn't classical capitalism. The opposite of stakeholder capitalism is democracy. And I think that is ultimately what's at issue here, is not just a defense of the way that companies used to do business for the integrity of a system of the way we make products and provide services, but rather the integrity of what democracy is all about. And that isn't just the physical act of going to the ballot box to cast your vote every November. It is the entire system of free, open deliberation, debate, reason and dialogue that ultimately is our foundation for actually being one people. We're to bring it back to big tech, we're nothing more than a group of higher mammals staring at our iPhones if we are not a people bound together ultimately by a set of shared values and a set of shared approaches to the way we work out our differences. And the thing that bothers me is not just the way big tech, although big tech has played a big role in this, but big corporations broadly have co-opted certain social values at the expense of others, recreating this new church of diversity that has ultimately killed the true diversity of ideas that I think makes America great. So, more on the book to come. It's coming out next summer, but that's one of the themes that I hit that's important to me, Ovik.
One strand to pick up on there that
please.
Back to your original question, Ovik, is you're kind of getting at that point of like, what are these sort of like neocortex things that we're doing, and then what are sort of like our baser instincts and how they play into these social issues. And Ovik, I think your original question was really around addiction, right? Like, how have we gotten to this point where Twitter can incite outrage? And I think it is very much in the business model of these companies that outrage drives some of that continued attention, right? And in an attention economy, it's a lot more valuable to incite outrage, whether it's towards kind of a woke socialist sort of vision of the world or towards sort of an angry rightist vision of the world, right? And I think that was a little bit in your framing of kind of all these conversations you're having over the course of this week is how do we have that higher mammalian conversation where we're saying we're going to rise a little bit above that. But to that addiction point, people I interact with in the technology world are some of the biggest Luddites that you'll meet. Joe has a more principled reason for getting off of Facebook, but I meet countless people in my work that spend all day thinking about investing in building technologies and don't use any of it, right? And so I think there's this interesting thing going on here where a lot of people are saying like, it is highly valuable to incite outrage without sort of fully internalizing the outputs of that and themselves kind of stepping back from it and saying, I want to pull myself out of that outrage machine myself.
Here's a question that's related. Go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, I wonder, I've seen a few references to this, but I'd love if anyone has anything more scholarly. Consider this hypothesis. At one point, we talked about the socioeconomic impact of the lack of access to technology. We think about rural broadband, and we think about all the people home from COVID impacting schools. I wonder if there's some element, if we think of technology addiction as something like Agent Orange, those who are near it and can't protect themselves from it incur a generational loss. I mean, we know that use of technology and this type of product actually reshapes the brain. So at the point where Apple executives send their kids to the Waldorf school and play with wooden blocks, what do they know that we don't know? But also, when you see low-income parents, single parents letting their kids sit in front of screens for hours on end, is this something that actually further divides classes because lower income people actually consume more screen time? That's a query, but a hypothesis.
Wow, yeah, that's a great question, Evan. And as I am very interested in this whole point about the neuroscience of the gadgets, of television, actually, television addiction as well, but obviously even more so with technology. Let me throw another healthcare related dagger into this conversation, which is we've been obviously dealing with this pandemic. One of the sub debates of the COVID-19 year that we've had has been what sort of commentary about public health policy should tech platforms and social platforms allow? And as much as I am very much a guy who thinks that we should open up the economy carefully and prudently and in a risk-oriented way, and have been sometimes frustrated with the suppression of that debate on tech platforms, I can also sympathize with the desire to get true misinformation off the web because it could be literally dangerous and a life or death situation. What's the right answer on that in that world?
The
Thinking about tech platforms.
obnoxious comments I've heard from smart friends in like bioinformatics is that the public health people in medicine are kind of like the critical race theory people in medicine, which is like a similar intellectual level and intellectual difficulties in terms of actually knowing what's going on and making things up. And obviously there are some smart people in the field, but there's a lot of nonsense in that field. And to me, it's really important not to censor things top down, because you have lots of examples even this year where they wanted to censor anything against WHO, and then WHO was very clearly wrong. They're telling you they didn't want to censor anything against CDC, but CDC was saying at first don't wear masks. I think it's really important not to have a single source of truth. That's much more dangerous in the world than the alternative. And unfortunately, people make mistakes. There's a danger to liberty, but there's a greater danger to lack thereof, is my view.
I agree with what Joe said. I want to add something to that, which is a cultural point in modern science, including public health scientists, but public health figures, but also modern science more generally. It's not a regulatory point, it's a cultural point. I think that scientists have fallen into the trap, maybe for understandable reasons, many of them at least, to overstating their claims overstating the certainty of their claims by 25%, in the hope that the public consumes and believes 75% of what they have to say. Because in this disinformation economy, someone else is going to counter it such that I have to, if I want to say the right thing, have to overstate my certainty in it by a certain percentage to leave a room for a discount factor that surely an average member of the public will apply when acting on the basis of my true findings. I think that new culture in science is a poison that is actually undermining public confidence in science itself. And I personally think the way forward for science as a cultural matter is going to be leadership through vulnerability, through owning the uncertainty that we have about any of our beliefs at any given point in time, and bringing the public along with us. And I think that we currently live in a state of the world where a lot of the scientific community is interwoven, as we're in the COVID-19 debates of this past year, with politics, with public policy. And I think the best state of the world, the idyllic state, is of course one in which science is entirely separate from politics. I think a second best to that, though, is one in which science and politics intersect, but scientists acknowledge when they're being politically responsive. I don't want to go into this too much, but I think that the timing of the vaccine data that we got earlier this week is interesting, and I think bears mention.
Yeah.
I think the worst of all worlds is one in which scientists pretend that they're entirely independent of politics, when in fact the two are intertwined. And I think that's the worst state of the world in which we're in today, and that's ultimately what erodes long-run public American interest in science as well.
To put it really in straight terms, like the universities are mostly completely conquered by the woke. Scientists are under these universities. If they do not go along, they will lose their jobs in many cases, or even if they have tenure, they'll lose the ability to have power and influence. So you see them all going along with whatever is woke, as opposed to all going along with the truth. In many occasions, it's very clear. Anyone who's missing that is lying to themselves.
Well, hey, and if people think Joe is exaggerating, which you should never think that, because he's always right. Two quick examples. Jim Lindsay is one of my absolute heroes. He has a great book on critical race theory, but importantly, he was at the center of the grievance studies affair. In this, he and several other academics under pseudonyms submitted these peer-reviewed studies, about 20 of them, that were totally made up, totally outrageous, and about half of them either were published or on track to get published. My favorite one was called Human Reactions to Rape Culture and Queer Performativity at the Dog Park, where they observed dogs raping each other to learn things about how humans rape each other. Anyway, the point is, these were totally bogus studies, and they were published. Now, take Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, who's peer-reviewed, who's published all the time, the same journals where he would regularly publish information about COVID-19 and how it spreads, is denied the ability to publish these peer-reviewed studies. So something is happening in the elite academic literature.
I think one more point that I would add, just sort of as a regulatory corollary to Vivek's cultural point on the sort of that 25-75 example that he gives, you have to think, I'll be the cliche University of Chicago person who talks about incentives. You have to think about the incentives of the regulators who are sitting in the chairs, right? If some great new technology or drug or therapeutic comes to market, the regulator doesn't get a pat on the back for that. But if anything goes wrong, they get angry calls, right? And so they really don't have any sort of upside incentive associated with allowing some new technological leap forward, but they have all kinds of downside incentives. And so I think you have to always be thinking about risk aversion and the way that plays out in the incentives, both in public health and
Totally agree. My favorite idea is that a small part of the pensions of regulators should be tied to how industry does the next 30 years in different ways, and then it would completely change things. But Probably can't do that in America.
Now, the COVID-19 vaccine example or therapeutics example is the exception that proves the rule, because they actually are taking heat for any barrier that stands in between where we are today and the delivery of a successful therapeutic or vaccine for COVID-19. And I think that we're going to have to grapple sometime next year, hopefully when we have successful vaccines distributed to a lot of people, with the doublespeak of regulators who at once say that is a safe, effective vaccine that you better darn well be sure you should take, or else you're anti-science, and saying that we have erected a process that ultimately takes over a decade to get something to market, because we can't be sure that this vaccine is safe and effective if it doesn't go through the decade-long process that we've otherwise erected in place. And that is the doublespeak we're going to have to contend with next year. And it's also the doublespeak in both directions that will go in overstating the certainty of our claims, where, yes, we're going to have less certainty in an average vaccine than we do in the first COVID-19 vaccine. And that's okay. And we ought to be transparent with the public about that. Just as we ought to be transparent about the fact that actually the historical process that we had for getting drugs and therapeutics and vaccines to market was probably far more cumbersome than it needed to be, in a way that this past year proved to us. So anyway, I agree with your point, Sal. I just think this is a year that offers a great exception that proves your rule.
I think one other neuron you just lit up in my brain is, you're talking about kind of the politicization of science. And I think we just went through this dangerous kind of shift where science just became this like monolithic category that's just, we've all just been beaten over the head with, right?
A new church.
Yeah. Science says X. Like, why are you anti-science? And I think science is sort of this capitalist project, right? Science in itself is competitive, right? The boundaries of science are not linear, and they're not, they're not top down. So I think it's
science needs a challenge process that's open to evolve, and we're in some cases we're pushing back on the challenge process for political reasons.
Anytime you have a believe the blank, it doesn't matter what you fill in the blank with. It's going to be a wrong way to advance our understanding of truth. And I'll leave it at that for the other options of what could fill in the blank, but science is one of them.
Well, in our remaining time, I want to get back to this addiction question, because that seems to me that's the one that's haunting me right now, right? That is the thing that I don't see an obvious solution to. Are there any obvious or non-obvious solutions? How do we transcend this era we're in, where children are growing up in a way that's so different from in any other generation?
I really appreciate Esther Dyson's comments all along the way. Some excellent questions. She should be on the panel. She's fantastic. But she says this: short-term desire is addiction. Long-term desire is purpose. A fantastic corollary, once you watch The Social Dilemma, is called Childhood 2.0. And it's a short doc that looks at the how basically kids were raised over the last several generations. The boomers played in the streets. They knew to come home when the lights turn on the street. It was time to come home. As a rabble-rousing kid, you had to make eye contact, invite someone to play, clean up a broken knee. We have totally rewired how children build relationships with each other. So one thought I love is something like Little Platoons Capital, some way to say, how do we drive investment and innovation in ventures that think first about building social capital, especially among kids? Is it a new soccer league, an Elks Lodge? Are we going to bowl together? A new bowling league? I don't even like bowling, but people should be bowling together, as Putnam famously critiqued. So I love Esther's point. I think something about how are we building relationships with each other in the flesh, especially among our kids?
Well, I can't wait to be able to do that with the four of you and everyone who's listening when we next get the chance to bring everyone together. So thank you all, Joe, Vivek, Evan, Sal. We could have gone on for a long time. We could have done an hour on any one of these subtopics. So thanks all of you for sparing some time out of your busy schedule. For those of you who are listening and watching, we will be back tomorrow at the same time, 3:30 Eastern, at the same Zoom URL link. You can find the full schedule of our conference at agenda.freeop.org tomorrow. The topic is education reform, both K through 12 reform and higher ed reform. We've got a terrific panel lined up for that. You won't want to miss it. Thanks again, everybody.
Guys.
Thank you.